Hey guys, Mike Teaches Programming here and welcome to a new Java Spring Boot tutorial. In today's episode we are going to be looking at exception handling within Spring Boot and how we can achieve it with the annotation called controller advice. Now, it's common practice to throw runtime exceptions in Spring Boot and allow Spring Boot to capture these exceptions. So I'm going to take you through what kind of not to do and what kind of is a better practice to do when you're creating all of your Spring Boot applications. So let's get right into it. What I've done here is created a simple Spring Boot application. What it does is has one endpoint, /get on cars or on car, and what it will do at the minute is create just this car. It's a Toyota and it's made in 2010 and it just returns it as a list. So now if I go and just make sure all is okay, I'll show you what it actually does. Let me spin it up and I will go to our, yep, that's working out. So I'll go to here, go to car and throw you can see here that we get a JSON representation of our model. So Toyota 2010, Toyota 2010. Now let's say somewhere we go to a database and the ID isn't there, or something happens in your services deep down in the code and you need to throw an exception. Okay, so this is what I have here. Now, this is what we don't want to do in our code. So we're going to throw new exception here and throw new exception, okay? Just leave it up here. So if the make of car is Toyota, I'm just going to quickly throw a new exception. So let's stop, run, and see what happens. So because we don't have it mapped to anything and we're not really doing anything with the code, you can kind of guess what it's going to happen. It's just going to throw an error. So let's go to the same endpoint, and yeah, you guessed it, we get a 500, something went wrong. So you can see here, we get our null pointer exception, or just a null exception, get cars, and here is where we throw it. Okay, so how can we catch these exceptions? How can we throw new exceptions and catch them and return a readable format to our users? So let's get right into it. So the first thing we need to do is create a new Java class, and we're just going to call it, let's call it exception our exception handler. Okay, and what we want to do is annotate it with at controller advice, not controller, because it's not a controller. Then what we need to do is extend response entity exception handler. Okay, and that is our simple controller, or our simple Spring Boot exception handler class. Now it's not handling anything at the minute, but let's just go back into our car controller. So let's say you want to throw an exception if the car is a Toyota because you don't like Toyotas, okay? So let's create a new exception class. So let's call it Toyota exception. Okay, and our Toyota exception extends a runtime exception. Okay, that is pretty much all we need to do at the current moment in time. Now we can set up different stuff in here, like we can have a constructor, we can have different variables in here. So I'm going to do that just to show you. So let's create a private string. Sorry, not that. Private string error message, and our error message is equal to I hate Toyotas or something like that, just if you have a grudge against them. And we have that final, should be final, private final string error message, so we cannot change it. Now we need to handle that exception. So it's not used anywhere and it's not really handled. So inside our exception handler, what we need to do is create a new method. And we can annotate it with @exceptionHandler. Now inside here, it takes the name of the class, okay? So the name of a runtime exception. So let's go Toyota exception dot class, okay? The next thing we do is we create a method to go along with that exception. So let's get right into that. So we go public response entity and we go object, and inside our object we call it handle Toyota, and what it takes is our exception. Okay, so inside here we will take Toyota exception, and we can then return a new response entity. And what will we return? So really what you need to do, what advice I would give you, is to make an error model class, okay? And for all of your errors, return the exact same error model. So that's exactly what I'm going to do now. So I'm going to call it error, and our error class will have one thing. It's just going to be a private string, what's wrong, or error, right? Okay, let's just call it error. And let's make our getters and setters. Oh, we need the two of them, not just our setter. So let's make a getter and a setter for error. So inside our exception handler, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new error class. So error is equal to new error, and error dot set error, and then we're going to take Toyota, our passed in parameter, exception dot. Now we have all of this stuff, but inside here, if I create a getter for it, generate a getter for our error message, and you can see here now it's available to us, and this get error message comes from our runtime exception. So now inside our exception handler, we can return error and HTTP status and bad request, or let's just call it internal server error. Okay, now that is our exception created, so that's our custom exception, and our custom exception is going to be handled all the time with this method, thanks to @controller advice. So for any more exceptions you create, any more custom exceptions, you create the exception, extends runtime. You can create constructors in here, pass in your string values, set different methods, and then you have access to it inside your method handler method right here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run it. Well, not yet, because we need to do one more thing. We need to throw this Toyota exception. So let's go into car controller. And instead of throw new exception, let's just throw new Toyota exception. Okay, so you can see here we don't need to throw it up here in the method header anymore, because there's a runtime exception. So if Toyota is equal to car.getMake, we just throw new Toyota exception. Okay, so I'm going to run it. And then after I run it, we are going to debug. So you can see here it started. So if I click on it now, you can see here that we get our error message back. Error, I hit Toyotas. Now, what I'm going to do is just show you again how that worked, but I'm going to debug it. And I'm going to put a debug point on our exception handler class. Okay? So whenever somebody comes in now and triggers the error, actually let's put one on the controller too, right here. So I'm going to trigger it. just click enter. Now it's holding. You can see here the debug point stopped here where we want to throw the exception. So if I move it along using this button here, you can see it jumps to our controller advice and we've caught our runtime exception, and then we map it to our error model. Because this is all really that you need to focus on, and getting all of your exception handling correct. It will reduce bugs and it will reduce all of your kind of clutter in your code. So, you know, think of what exceptions you need to throw, create them all into different packages, and use an exception handler to map them all to the same error model. This is probably one of the best practices I've seen, and hopefully it helps you in creating a cleaner Spring Boot project. So I'm going to end the video here, but if you did like it, subscribe for more, ask questions in the comments, I will answer them. If you need me to look at code or anything, don't be afraid to send it on. So yeah, any other videos you guys want, just leave a comment as well. And thanks for listening. Bye.